If you want to follow along with this week's tutorial, make sure you go to willgibbons.com/downloads to get your project files. We will be using them to follow along with this tutorial. All right, guys, so today what we're going to be working on is building this wooden texture that you see on the spatula here in KeyShot. And what's really fun about this is it's fully procedural. And if we zoom in, you're going to see that we have a crazy amount of detail here with all sorts of wood grain being pushed off the surface of this material. This one was a lot of fun to make. Let's dive in. Okay, first steps first, we are going to go into KeyShot and we are going to grab our files that you downloaded. Open up the project files, you'll find your step file, drag that into KeyShot. Go ahead and take the default import settings, hit M if your library is not showing, find your environments, double click the 3-panel straight 4K. I'm gonna close that because we don't need that anymore. Next, I'm going to double click our spatula and I'm going to change it from diffuse down to plastic. And we're going to make it a black glossy plastic to start. The reason for this will become clear in a bit. Let's hit C to go to a white background and then double click our material and pop into our material graph. Right click, down to textures, find our wood advanced. Hit C to preview. Let's go ahead and move the texture. Let's rotate it 90 degrees holding shift. And then we can move it around to play with the shape a little bit. It looks pretty weird, so let's go ahead and fix some of these settings. Let's take our variation in every single category down to 0. And now we have a very uniform looking grain or rings. Now let's take our ring width up to 1. And underneath ring width, let's take our ring width variation up to 1 as well. And now if we take our ring spacing variation and we bring this up to 1, we'll see we get even more interesting patterns. Now this is a little bit much, so let's bring this down to maybe 0.5. And maybe we can take our scale from 5 down to 4, get a little bit more dense. Now let's find our ring width and take it up to 2. Actually, let's go lower, let's go 0.5. Now our ring noise, let's try if we go to 1, we'll see it gets wavy. Let's try something small like 0.1. Let's take our axial noise and go up to 1 and see what it does. It gives us those long waves. Let's go 0.2. And then for our color noise, if we go up to, let's see, 1, we'll see it gives us that rippled effect. So let's go maybe 0.2. There we go. And then our seasonal color noise, I like to crank this all the way up to 1. It gives us this dark variation, which is really nice. Let's go under our knots. Now, our reference does have a knot. It's this big dark splotch in the center. This, I'm going to warn you, is very difficult to do in KeyShot, and it's very difficult to make it look good, and we have limited control over it. If we take our knot density and we increase it up to, maybe go up to 1, they're not showing up. Why is that? Actually, they may be showing up. They look a little bit different here. Let's take our knot color down to black. Ah, there we go. So they were there. We just could not see them. And let's take our knot border color and let's darken that a bit too. Okay, so we have our knots. We want one of them kind of in the middle. So if we take our knot density down to say 0.2, now we have one knot in the center so far. That's looking pretty good. Let's see if we can move it. Now here's the risk. If we move this, we might show, some other knots might show up. Also, this one disappears as we move it because it's moving through the grain of the wood. We have to understand that this is a fully 3D procedural texture. In order to get the knot we want exactly where we want it and everything, is really just like playing the lottery at this point. We can try, I might be okay with 2 knots there, or I could try reducing this number to see if I can get one of them to go away. So now if I move it again, we might lose it, we'll see. Yeah, we kind of lose it there. Maybe if I pull up or push down, ooh, there we go. So this one popped up. Do we have them anywhere else? Not anywhere else that I can see. I'm happy with this because again, I know I have limited control over this, so I might just take it where I can get it type thing. So we have our knot. Now let's go ahead and shape it a little bit. If we zoom in, it's just black. Let's take it a little bit lighter than black. And we see there is some grain in there, which is cool. So let's bring it down pretty dark though, because our reference is very, very dark. Let's just go by visual. So if I bring this up a bit, and then we take our knot border and make sure that's nice and dark, we can get that dark edge, or we can lighten it. Now it's not having a huge effect because we haven't increased the size. So let's take our knot age from 5 to 6. Let's take our knot border all the way up to 1 and see what that does. So that gives us an edge where we see this darker color. We can go really dark or we can go light, and then it just kind of softens the edge, which that actually might produce a pretty nice effect. Now, if we take our knot distortion up to say 0.5, it's gonna get wavy. Go all the way up to 1, it gets really crazy. Let's just leave it at a small number. 0.1 is pretty fine, maybe 0.2. And then our branch scale is also going to distort this further. I'm not quite sure exactly how, but again, we're just going by visual. We're trying to get close. I'll darken the knot color because I want it to really look dark and almost burnt. And there we're looking pretty good for our knots. Let's go ahead and see if there's anything else anywhere. Looks pretty good. So now we're going to move on to grain. And this is huge. This is where we really get a lot of this detail to show up. And I'm gonna go ahead and call this out. This is a very old, worn spatula that's seen a lot of wear. It almost has this velvety, very soft grain on the surface where these fuzzies, which again, this camera is probably not gonna show it, but these little fuzzies really stick out and make this look interesting. So I'm gonna try to capture some of that detail in our model, although it will be a little bit tough. All right, moving on, let's try to play with the grain. So if we take our grain color bleed up to 1, the way I like to use these is I usually increase a value all the way up to 1 to see its overall effect that it has. And we can see we're getting these lines in here. Let's try taking our axial graininess up to 1, and you'll see we get much more of these lines. So this is a bunch of that inner detail. It also kind of softens everything, so our rings don't look so distinct, which is good. But if we take our grain color bleed down to 0.5, you'll see it's not quite as heavy. Again, all of this is to personal taste, so there's no right or wrong way to do this. Now, if we take our ring graininess up to 1, depending on what we're seeing here, sometimes that can create these spider effects. So here we can see it. It's these lines that are cutting through our entire image. I don't want any of that, to be honest. So I'm going to take that down to 0. And our grain scale is going to, of course, be how big our grain is. So if we take this up to, say, 3, we'll get much of a larger grain pattern. And I do imagine we want this to be pretty small. And if we take our grain thinness and we increase it, they're just going to get skinnier. So if we go from 1 to, say, 3, then this gets even streakier and thinner. So if we want it to be a little chunkier, we would leave this down at a lower number. And I think for me, what I'm going to do is take the grain scale down to 1. I want it to be pretty small. Axial graininess is nice and high, and then grain color bleed. I might leave this at 1 for now, and then maybe go back and change it. Maybe 0.75. That's good. Now, under advanced, we have this thing called seed. If you want a randomly generated version of the same set of settings, you can play with seed. This is great if you have a wood flooring where you have a bunch of boards and you want them all to look similar but be actually different in their pattern. You would go and unlink each wood plank and you would use this seed to generate an absolutely new version of what you have. And this number doesn't mean anything. It's just another random result using the same parameters. So let's take this down to 0 because I like mine the way it is. And the last thing we're going to get into here is playing with some overall color. And if we get out of our preview here, we're going to get another node to do that with. Whew, okay. So let's go ahead and right click, get a color adjust, and plug our wood advanced into the color. We're also going to name this wood advanced wood color. So inside our color adjust, we'll hit C to preview, and now we can try to kind of match our photo reference, which looks like it's almost got more contrast and it's a little whiter. And let's go ahead and take our contrast up to 1.2. And let's take our value up a little bit, 1.2 as well. Maybe our saturation down to 0.9. That's looking pretty good. We have a little, I think the contrast is actually too much. Maybe 1.1. Okay, so the next thing I want to be able to do is darken some of these areas a little bit more. So we're going to go ahead and use what's called a color composite and a color gradient. Right click to get our texture, color gradient, C to preview, and I'm going to rotate. I'll hit move texture and I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, and I'm going to scale this down to something like 10 millimeters. And we see we have a white to black gradient. So see how the side of the spatula is darker? We're going to fade across this. So if I zoom out, I want to actually rotate my texture a little bit more so it's not so much on the handle. Perfect. All right. Now, if we go ahead and hit C to preview, get out of preview, we're going to right click, utilities, color composite, color adjust into source, color gradient into background. Hit C to preview color composite and set your blend mode to multiply because we're multiplying the color gradient on top of the color adjust, and reduce the background alpha, which is, we'll go down to 0.5. This is the actual effect or the strength of our color gradient. So now we've darkened this edge pretty nicely, and this creates some nice variation. There's some more down here at the bottom. And by the way, this is a fairly worn spatula. This is going to be darker because I've cooked with it. There's oils and stuff that have sunk into it. So we're going to get another color gradient. We're going to actually click on our color gradient to color composite connector, right click, utilities, another color composite, and we're going to duplicate our color gradient, double click it, and hit C to preview. We're going to move the texture. We're going to rotate this one in this direction, and we're going to move it down quite a bit. And interestingly enough, we're going to increase the size. So let's go to something like 60. So now I have a very subtle gradient. And I'm going to go ahead and move the white down a little bit, about halfway. And then I'll hit C to get out of preview, plug this into the background of our new color composite, double click it, set it to multiply. And now if we preview our original color composite, we see the dark tip down there as well. And with our new color gradient, if I want to finesse this now, I can pull it back so it's not quite so strong. And maybe I do want to move this white up so it's got kind of a bit more of a subtle gradient. And lastly, in our color composite, we're going to take what's going into the background. We're going to chop this down a little bit. So 0.75, I don't want this to be quite so dark down here. So now we're kind of matching the spatula a little bit. And what I want to do, I want to pull some of the yellow out of here as well. So back into our color adjust, we're going to double click on it and take our saturation from 0.9 down to say 0.8. There we go. That's looking better. So now what we want to do is get some of the graininess, the kind of little stuff sticking out on the surface and all those little inner details. So we're going to go ahead and hit C to get out of our color composite. And at this point, I know we still haven't connected this to our plastic yet. I actually want to duplicate my wood, and I'm going to use a different wood texture. Let's rename it from wood color to wood bump displace. So this is where we're going to use this texture to create a lot of these very, very small surface details. And this is also where if your computer struggles to keep up with displacement in KeyShot, then maybe use this in the bump channel instead of the displace channel. But I'm going with displacement just because I'm going for the closest match as I can get. Now, the reason we duplicated this is because we want to make some changes to the colors. So double click on this and uncheck sync, double click our original wood texture, uncheck sync, and then go back to our wood displace bump node. And now we're going to hit C to preview. We want to turn this whole thing into black and white values, but we also want to really isolate the grain that we have in here. So let's take our winter down to black. Let's take our spring to black. Let's take our fall to black. And let's take our summer to white. And let me see, let's see. Maybe I'll take the fall to white as well. So we have a good amount of white and black. And I'm really looking for this kind of graininess. Now the reason we unchecked sync was so this doesn't affect our original wood texture. And in our grain, if we can, I'm going to take our grain color bleed up to 1, and then I'll try it up to 2. So now we're getting mostly just this noise which corresponds with our wood. And if we take our grain thinness and we go down to say 0.5, it should make it a little more chunky, maybe 0.1. I don't know. It doesn't like, I might just have to drag this down. Our grain scale, let's make it a little larger, 1.5. Okay, now I want to go in and see what else I want to do. Maybe under variation, I'll take our seasonal color noise down to 0, so we don't have those streaks. Maybe our ring noise goes up to 0.2. Okay, so let's try this. Now we're going to get a color to number, plug this guy in, and this time we're going to preview color to number, and we're going to take our input from and start to increase it to darken those black areas. We really want to isolate little white bits of grain. So let's keep going. Let's go up to 0.9. And let's take our output 2 and take this up to 2. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to plug this into, we're going to hold on to this. This is going to be plugged into either bump or displace, depending on what you're working, which route you're going to take. Before we do that, though, let's nail our roughness and our, let's nail roughness. So let's take our wood color output and plug this into our plastic down to roughness. Already it looks very good, but we want to fix a couple things. It's too glossy in the knot, and I want to even this out a little bit. So let's go ahead and get a color to number. And this guy, we're going to hit C to preview. White is going to be completely rough, whereas black is going to be completely glossy. So let's take our output from and lighten up that knot and everything else. And then we'll darken everything else by taking our output 2 down a little bit. I want there to be just enough shininess or sheen so we can reflect some light. I don't want it to be completely diffuse, but it shouldn't be glossy either. So we'll go ahead and give this a shot. Maybe we go a little bit darker with the output 2. And maybe our output from drops a little bit as well. And our input from increases to darken some of those, or make some of those other areas a little glossier. There, so we now have some wood grain defined just by roughness. And we're going to go ahead now and try our displace. So let's take our color to number, and we're going to get it and plug it into a geometry node called Displace. We're plugging this into geometry, and we're plugging color to number into Displace. Double click Displace and set our displacement height down to 1. Now we're going to go ahead and take, let's just go ahead and hit execute geometry node. And you see we get these big, chunky, hairy looking things sticking out. So this is pretty ugly. We need to reduce our triangle size and increase our maximum triangles in order to have a high enough resolution so that these don't look like big triangular pyramids or spikes. They'll look like individual tiny little bumps. There's another thing I'm going to do to vary the length of these. So we're going to go ahead and after our color to number, we're going to right click, go to Utilities, Color Composite. We're also going to get a texture called Noise. We're going to plug this into the background. C to preview noise. We're going to make this larger, like 50. And it's hard to see, whoopsies, my keyboard's freaking out. So you can see now we have these large patches or splotches. So let's now go ahead and take our color composite and our source alpha, which is our wood bump. Let's take this down to 0.2, very low amount. And let's go ahead and try refreshing our displace. So in our geometry nodes, we'll click this again. And now you can see we have the noise, which is the white areas. We're going to have a little bit of a, oops, sorry, we didn't do that yet. Color composite, let's set this to multiply. Now let's try. There we go. So now what we're getting is we're getting the noise where the whiter areas, it's going to be a little bit longer, and the blacker areas, the little spikes will be shorter. So now we have this kind of patchy looking natural distribution. Now, interestingly enough, we are getting these weird grid lines, and some of this is coming from the grain, but some of this is also coming from the actual geometry on our spatula. We need higher resolution in order to avoid that. So let's go ahead and try. Also, you notice the waviness here. This is a little extreme here. So I don't want my spatula looking too chunky. So I'm gonna actually take the scale of the noise up to 75, and I'll take its color 2, which is white. I'll take this down to 50%, and now we'll go ahead and refresh. So now we're looking quite a bit better, but we're losing a lot of that detail. So maybe what we want to do is take this up to something like 80. Let's try that again. That's looking better. Okay, so now back in our Displace, let's take our triangle size down to 0.1, so a big jump. And now we're getting a lot of the stubble that we were looking for. Pretty cool. We may be limited right now by our maximum triangles. This number is in the millions, and it prevents our total triangle count from getting too high. It's like to protect your computer from blowing up if you, or KeyShot from freezing really, if you put too high of a number. So right now we're limiting it to 6 million triangles. If I lift this number to 20 and I hit execute, our 4.5 million triangles is probably going to go up to pretty much of a higher number. And you can tell it's taking longer. So yeah, it's going to make a lot more triangles. Ooh, okay, so almost 20 million triangles. And now we have all this nice little stubble sticking off the surface. And it's looking quite a bit better. And it's looking pretty choppy and rough, but I think it's actually going to serve us quite well. Because again, we want this to be creating this little fuzzy stuff we have going on. So one thing I'll also do is take our displacement height down to 0.75, so not quite so long. All right, much better. So now we're looking pretty good and convincing even without our color texture. We've got displaced texture detail, but we have not even used our bump channel yet. Again, if your computer cannot handle displacement, use the wood advanced into the bump over here, and then you can use a noise texture and a color composite into the bump height here to control the rest of those values. So let's take our wood color and plug this into bump. It's a little bit aggressive, so let's go into our wood advance and take our grain bump height down to 0, and you'll see we get quite a bit of a smoother result. And we could take our ring bump height down. And now in this case, the spatula, the rings aren't bumpy. So we're going to take this down to 0, and we're going to take our grain bump height up to 0.5. And that's still a bit much. Let's take it down to 0.3. There we go. Now we're looking pretty good. Let's now at this point, finally, we're going to take our color composite, our last color composite, and plug it into the diffuse color of our plastic. And now we've got our spatula color and all sorts of those tiny little surface details going on. At this point, we are looking very good. We could call this a day and be done. Now, when I zoom out, you don't see all of that little detail that we just put all that effort into creating. So I'm going to show you at the end of this how to light our product so all that little detail stands out. So to get some more stains and randomness on here, let's first go ahead and align our nodes to our work area with that button so we can see our nice little material graph. Now we're going to go and right click and get another texture called granite. Now with granite, if we hit C to preview, let's make this quite a bit smaller. Let's go down to 50. And for our granite, let's go ahead and make sure it is set to white as our color. Let's take our granite down to utilities, color to number. And let's take our color to number and take our output 2 to 2, 3.5. What this is doing, if we take our background alpha to 0, you can see it's having literally no effect. So in this case, let's go ahead and just delete our noise texture, delete our color composite. Actually, no, we're going to need it. We're going to take our previous color composite that's going directly into our plastic. We're going to plug this into the background. And we're going to take our newest color composite and put it into diffuse. And then right now, what we want to make sure we do is we're going to multiply our newest color composite. So instead of overlay, let's try multiply. And notice it's looking weird. Let's take our background alpha up to 1. They're still a little bit much, so let's take our source alpha down to 0.5. And there we go, they look good. And we can play with our color to number to reduce the amount of those. So if we take our 3.5 up to 4, let's go ahead and preview. Let's go up to maybe 6. Now we have just a small amount. And we can also play with our distribution by double clicking on our texture and moving it around if we don't like where those are showing up. And now here it just gives us a little bit more extra wear and kind of stains and stuff like that. Very subtle, shouldn't be very noticeable. What I'm gonna do is this. I'm gonna reduce my color to number to say like 4, make those a little bit larger, but I'm gonna take my color composite and reduce the source alpha so they're a lot lighter, so they're not quite so heavy. So maybe 0.2. So we're looking pretty good. Maybe I want a little more contrast overall in this final image. So to the right of my color composite, I'm going to use a color adjust and take our contrast up a little, 1.1, and maybe my value down just a hair, 0.95. We're looking quite nice. We can go ahead and save this. So let's name this Wood Rough Cherry Procedural Displaced. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you how to light this as I mentioned so you can get the actual fluff, so to speak, to show up that chunkiness. If you want to stop now, you can. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm going to close the material graph. Control 5 adds a plane. We're going to take this plane, we're going to rotate it, move it away, and we'll go ahead and double click it. Let's set it to Kelvin, somewhere neutral, and change it from diffuse to an area light. If we take our environment and just drop its brightness down to 0, everything gets darker. Let's go ahead and hit E to show our environment, Control G to add a ground plane. And at this point, if we go ahead and change our background color, this will really allow our spatula to pop out. If we zoom in, we're going to see all that good displaced texture on the surface. Now we may be getting a little bit of a grid pattern along the side. This may just have to do with our tessellation. Not sure if there's much we can do. Maybe we can recalculate normals to fix that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Overall, I like how rough the edge looks because that grain is really exposed where it's a little smoother on top. Now, the lower our light gets, the more of our grain is going to show. So if you really want that grain to pop, you can drop a light source down to the side. If we move our light source, let's just hover over this and hit Control D, and then hit pick, and then click our spatula, hit OK. If we rotate that light down to have a long shadow, of course, you'll see our wood grain really stands out. So it just depends on how much you're gonna, how you're gonna light this and how rough you want this to be. If you want that to be almost smooth, then don't even do the displace at all. You don't need that, or you could just reduce the value here. So I'm gonna go ahead and move that light back up where it was. And at this point, we are done with this material. I'm not gonna go through the render process because this is already a very long tutorial. In the future though, if you want me to go through the render process, let me know and we can try to do that. I'll go back to my white background and I'll make sure I have a little bit of ambient brightness. So we'll bring this up to 0.5, and under the light bulb, we'll go to product mode. So we have some global illumination, looks a little bit more natural. All right, you guys, and there you have it. Another Material Graph Monday in the can. Let me know what you thought about this episode. If these are getting too long, I'll probably do some basic ones the next couple of weeks just to kind of cool things down a little bit. But hopefully you guys liked it. Make sure you subscribe if you did. Give me a thumbs up. Let me know what you want to see next. And until next time, happy rendering.